profile of his death mask there. Early days, they couldn't dig graves in the wintertime. It was frozen, they couldn't dig because they dug everything by hand. It would take 2 men 8 hours to dig a grave. But this building was used to hold the bodies. So if you died in January and the ground was frozen, you couldn't be buried until April or May when the ground thawed. And so your body would be put in there for storage. Well, it cost $1 to get put in there, and at that time it was a lot of money. And then every so many days or weeks or whatever, then they had to pay rent. So I thought that was interesting. It holds, I think I counted 18. So there are places, it's like they could, things coming out of the wall where they could slide the caskets into. And
Hi, this is Johnny Morehouse. This is one of the most prominent pieces of artwork in the cemetery, and it's one of the most asked about. The boy and his dog. It was sculpted by Daniel Ladow in the late 1800s for Johnny after he passed away. Johnny Morehouse was a 5-year-old boy. His father was a cobbler who had a shop near the canal and used to run through downtown Dayton along where Patterson Road is today. If you watch closely as you drive down Patterson, you can still see some of the old stones that was part of the canal. Well, Johnny was playing near the canal with his friends when he fell into the water. His friends ran to get his father, and the dog jumped in after him to retrieve him. When Johnny's father returned, the dog had pulled Johnny from the water and was standing over him in much the same position, guarding him, but Johnny had drowned. There is no written history of this. It's just word of mouth that has been passed down through the cemetery through the years. It goes that Johnny was buried here 3 days later. The grave was unmarked since the father was not a wealthy man. A few days later, his dog showed up at the grave and stayed for days. People that came would bring water and food for the dog. He stayed for several days and then he disappeared. He is not buried here. They do not know what happened to the dog or what kind of dog it is. It was not unusual for children to die during the Victorian era, where many graves of children at Woodland. However, the story touched the hearts of everyone that heard it. Since Johnny's death, his grave has been continually decorated. Even today, we clean it off and it comes back very quickly. There are all kinds of things: toys, money, candy, even juice boxes. Several years ago, a tree limb did fall and broke the dog's head off. They did fix it, but there is a crack that is noticeable, so the only thing that the cemetery does place is bandana to cover the crack so that children aren't upset by it.
That it's been heard and known that if you put your hand here next to the dog's nostrils, you can feel him breathing. Yeah. So if anybody wants to try that.
This is our Adam Shantz. At one point he bought, I think, 100 acres over there in the Shantz area, Shantz Avenue area. And he actually had a racetrack over there. And it was his son who started building the houses. So some of those big, magnificent houses over there were actually built by Adam Shantz's son. Young man. He came here at the age of 15 with his 4 brothers from Germany. And he was a very likable young man. And he worked in a butcher shop. And he was a good worker. People liked him. But he decided he wanted to go back to Europe to see his family. He'd been here for 2 or 3 years. Wanted to go home see Mom. So he made his way to New Orleans, and he got a job in a butcher shop that cut the meat for the big ships that went to England or went to Europe. And he made friends very easily, and he talked his way onto one of the ships, and he worked for his passage. He actually fell overboard on the way to Europe, had to be fished out of the sea. And so it wasn't an easy trip for him, no guess, but he made it, and he got home and stayed in Germany for a little while, and then he worked his way back. He decided to come back. And he worked his way back across Europe into England, and he was working in a butcher shop that cut the meat for the big ships, and talked his way passage back onto that ship and came home. Now when he got here, he was, a bit older, and he decided to open a butcher shop. He had a job, and he decided to open a butcher shop of his own, and it was down on Brown Street near 5th, where the Oregon District, in the Oregon District, is where his first shop was. And he was a very unfortunate little guy. That one caught fire and burned to the ground. And then he had enough. He talked a banker or somebody into loaning him enough money to rebuild, built it bigger and better, and he decided to sell that one, and he opened a brewery. And he, I'm trying to make sure I'm telling the correct way, but he decided to sell that one. He traded it for one that's down by the river, right where Riverscape is, down that area. He was down in there somewhere, and he let his insurance, fire insurance had become a thing, and he'd had insurance, but he let it lapse about noon that day, and he'd forgotten to go renew it, and at 8 o'clock that evening his business got hit by lightning and it burned to the ground. Well, he was able to talk somebody into building it bigger and better again. Well, what he did, though, I mean, I guess he was a real high character person, and he kept his word. If he told you he'd pay you, he always did, so they trusted him. Well, he decided to diversify, and at one point he was actually a part owner in at least 10 breweries, but he made his money because as a brewer he needed pure water. So he invented a way to a water purification system, and he made his money by selling bottled water. It was the Lily Water Company, and he sold most of his purified water to other breweries. So the Lily Water Company, you could buy a bottle of water for 5 cents a bottle, and I think that was a lot of money back then. But bottled water's not cheap today either. Or they had the big jugs that they would take to companies and trade them out. So the bottled water craze is not a new thing. So, sound symbols here. When the cemetery opened, you bought a lot. It was up to you to keep it mowed and trimmed, and the trees trimmed, and the flowers planted and brought back up. So this was a garden cemetery, and that's what it was for. The Victorians, this was actually a precursor to the public park system, and the Victorians would come here on the weekends and bring a picnic, and the family would all come and gather, and they'd have their picnic and clean up the graves.
That's all that, there's no history on that other than it was a garage sale item.
That is so cool.
In the Victorian time, they were not allowed to show grief. So they used to do it on the stones. You don't hardly see that anymore because we're allowed to cry, but they weren't allowed to. This over here is a good example. The 2 columns there with the urns on top and the ivy wrapped around, that's a husband and wife in eternal keeping. The ivy means eternal life. Okay? Anytime you see an urn on top of a stone, that means death. That comes from the Egyptians. When they would mummify a body, they would put the organs in the jar in the belief that would help their loved ones go on to the promised land, okay? However the Egyptians believed. But that's where our death urn comes from, that we use. You will see a lot of that through the cemetery. If you see a towel wrapped on it, draped on it, that's the crying towel. Remember, we couldn't show our sorrow in those days, so we had to do it through symbolism. Owen, Mr. Owen is what we call Mr. Transportation, Public Transportation. He started the RTA. That's Mr. Owen, and if you notice, see how the bus is engraved on his stone? Yeah. That's a form of lithograph that they do. It's very difficult, but it's very